that this understanding of the lyric has come to be the dominant one. And this is the first quotation on the handout. Excuse me. Lyric comes to describe a short poem that is neither narrative nor discursive, as in the epideictic mode. It is an utterance that is curiously outside of time, rather than tied to a special occasion. A self-expressive declaration directed towards an absent or imaginary presence, rather than to a reader. In the wake of Romantic poetry, the lyric has come to be seen, as Brewster indicates here, as the personal utterance of a self, as introspective, looking inwards, as otherworldly, as a mode that floats free outside of time, and that possibly reaches for transcendence, or at least for some kind of philosophical insight. So the poet draws away from the world and reflects on things to himself. And I'll use the male pronouns to begin with and gradually introduce female ones. The kind of subjectivity to which the lyric gives voice has generated much analysis. I'm going to show in the second part of my lecture that the lyric I is a problem for women poets. But what I want to indicate to begin with is that the lyric I is a problem anyway for all poets. It's very difficult to define it, and there are conflicting accounts of what the purpose of the lyric I is and how it serves us in reading a poem. Even though sincerity, spontaneity, and authenticity are sometimes marks of the I that speaks, for instance, in Renaissance love sonnets, such as the sonnets of Philip Sidney or William Shakespeare. And there's also an awareness that the I in lyric poetry, such as in love poems, is an entirely artificial construct. It's simply put together by the poet, and he's using all kinds of inherited devices, tropes and traditions. Catherine Ing, in her study of Elizabethan poetry, distinguishes between two kinds of selves in 16th and 17th century selves. She calls them personal selves and impersonal ones. She says, sometimes we hear a voice from the invisible. So sometimes the lyric I seems to come from nowhere. It's an author who is placeless, almost outside of time. But sometimes we hear a voice that is the speech of a personality. So there is a seemingly general I in the poem, but gradually we begin to see this I as the utterance of some kind of personality that has particular characteristics. Often, however, I think these forms of voice converge, and the personal voices and the impersonal ones come together. And the I that speaks in the lyric poem is often also given a kind of Vatic or priestly authority. So the I speaks, again in terms that I used earlier on, because he has command over some kind of wisdom or philosophy or insight. Or even if this lyric I is simply discussing emotions, these emotions in some way have an extra weight. They will convince the audience, and they somehow have a transpersonal purchase because of the importance of the I itself. Indeed, it would be fair to say that all pronouncements on the lyric I ultimately seem to home in on underlying contradictions and tensions in the forms of expressivity that we expect in a lyric poem. Sometimes people seem to expect the lyric poem to be totally private. On other occasions, the lyric I is seen as so generic and universal that it can sustain a kind of public utterance. Personal and impersonal, as I've mentioned, also come together. And we move next to an example of a poet struggling with the sense of his self in his poetry. And this is W.B. Yeats, the Irish poet, at the very end of his life, thinking about the self that he introduces into his own poetry. And Yeats here is actually wrapping up his career. He was writing an introduction for the collected poems, which were published posthumously. And here Yeats is trying to come up with definitions, but you'll immediately see he runs into contradictions, and he begins to contradict himself. A poet writes always of his personal life. In his finest work, Out of Its Tragedy, whether it be remorse, lost love, or mere loneliness. He never speaks directly to someone as at the breakfast table. There is always phantasmagoria. Even when the poet seems most himself, he is never the bundle of accident and incoherence that sits down to breakfast. He has been reborn as an idea, something intended, complete. In some ways, Yeats seems to want to have it both ways here, and he seems to also be carefully laying down certain types of separation between categories. The poet does have a personal life and speaks from that. So Yeats himself saw part of his career as belonging to a late phase of Romanticism, and on that level, he seems to support this here. But yet, he then argues that the poet changes in the process of writing. There's a recent book which has a chapter titled Yeats at Breakfast, and Yeats seems to have had great misgivings about what happened at the breakfast table, and he definitely didn't want the breakfast table in his poems. So he says somehow the poet changes. He's not a bundle of accident and incoherence. So Yeats actually here does seem to be supporting the view that the poet is personal on the one hand, impersonal on the other, an ordinary human being who has a lived life and who can convince you, because of the strength of his emotions, which come out of his everyday life, but also because he's priestly. We move next to Theodore Adorno, who also in some ways seems to agree with Yeats' account of the poet. But Adorno wants a link. Yeats preserves a link to the personal life, so he keeps that. Adorno wants to keep a link to society. So the author that Adorno thinks about is the isolated I, the lyric I, but this lyric I is part of society. The I whose voice is heard in the lyric is an I that defines and expresses itself as something as opposed to the collective, to objectivity. It is not immediately one with the nature to which expression refers. It has lost it, as it were, and attempts to restore it through animation, through immersion in the I itself. The lyric work is always the subjective expression of social antagonism. So Adorno here seems to support the commonplace understanding of a romantic lyric form in particular as an expression of an isolated self. But he sees this subjectivity and this isolation of the lyric I as some kind of guarantee for the social links in the poem, and particularly for the social antagonism that a poet can put forward. We move next to another poet, and it's noticeable that particularly the modernist poets like Yeats and now T.S. Eliot worry about this dividing line between the author and the writer as a real-life person and the projected version of that author in the poem. Eliot goes further than Yeats or Adorno again. What Eliot says is that the personal life of the poet must be totally suppressed. So the author, as a writer who walks the streets, for Eliot, in his very well-known essay, controversial essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, has to somehow mask or suppress himself. Just quoting, what happens, as Eliot says, is a continual surrender of himself as he is at the moment to something which is more valuable. The progress of an artist is a continual self-sacrifice, a continual extinction of personality. Maud Ellman, in her brilliant account of the poetics of impersonality in Eliot and also Ezra Pound, however, inspects the statements by Pound and Eliot much more closely. And she comes to the conclusion that they, as she says in the quotation, recoil against themselves. And she says that Eliot's theory hints that personality is the inevitable consequences of writing, as opposed to the impersonality of speech. Eliot and Pound both show that it is impossible to overcome the self. But this does not mean that their work is merely a disguise for their biographies. Their work should be regarded neither as their mirror nor their hiding place, but as the laboratory for the fabrication of themselves. And so Elman, in reflecting on how Pound and Eliot play with the idea of the impersonal author, once again shows that it is contradictory, that the personality of these authors does emerge within their poetry, but not in a biographical way, in a poetic play. They fabricate themselves in their poems. I move next to another phase within the writing of the self and the lyric I in the 20th century, and that is confessional poetry. And I just want to touch on this very briefly because it will provide a context for a poem that we'll be looking at later. Confessional poetry, as many of you will know, was a mode of poetry associated particularly with American poets, such as Anne Sexton, Robert Lowell, and Sylvia Plath. And in confessional poetry, the poet draws very overtly on his own experience, and there's no attempt to disguise. So this type of poetry is reacting against the high-minded manner of poets like Yeats and T.S. Eliot, or even Aurora, who think that you can lay personality and your real self aside. These poets do not apologise for this real self. They make it the basis of their poetry. Confessional poetry, of course, was controversial. And I give you here a quotation by an Irish poet and critic reflecting on the confessional style of Michael Hoffman, the British-German poet. O'Driscoll begins by quoting W.H. Auden. Who the hell cares about Anne Sexton's grandmother? W.H. Auden supposedly spluttered after a poetry reading. The poet must make us care, beguile us into caring, invest more skill in telling the tale, and paradoxically exemplify a self-forgetful confessionalism. It's interesting that O'Driscoll here is using the same kind of ploy as the other modernist poets that I have been citing, in order to make confessionalism less objectionable, the personality of the poet seeping too much into the poem. What he says is that this self must withdraw all over again, mask itself in some way. And the question is, must this be so? And these are the questions that the women poets that we're now going to look at and reflect on. I'll begin with Boland. Firstly, to introduce you to her as a figure. Evan Boland is seen as the most prominent Irish poet, woman poet, at the current moment. Primarily because she was at the vanguard of a group of poets who changed the Irish poetry scene in the 1960s and the 1970s. But Boland was the person who changed Irish poetry by introducing female voices into the scene. In an early essay that became very famous subsequently, Outside History, Boland talks about the change that took place in Irish poetry when you change from thinking about the lyric I as a he to the lyric I as a she. Over a relatively short time, I'm quoting Boland, certainly no more than a generation, women have moved from being the objects of Irish poems to being authors of them. It is a momentous transit. It is also a disruptive one. And so we carry that phrase with us, her insistence that women have shifted from objects to authors, and see actually that she keeps both categories in her poems. She plays with notions of the author, the subject, and the object. But the objectification that Boland and other women of her generation wanted to react against most strongly was the way in which women were rendered as symbols in Irish poetry up to that point. I move next to two quotations from a recent collection of essays by Boland that reflect on problems to do with the lyric I. And Boland here is going back to some of the earlier issues that she wrote about as a younger woman and thinking them through all over again. The first essay is called A Journey with Two Maps. And it's in this essay that she thinks about becoming a poet and why it was a problem for her to become a woman poet in Ireland. She began writing poetry as a young student. She attended university in Dublin. She herself moved around a lot. Her father was a diplomat, so she left Ireland around 6 or 7, went to school in England, in the UK, in London, and felt an outsider there because she spoke with an Irish accent. Then her father got a posting in New York, so she attended high school in New York for a number of years. But at 14, she had to move all over again. She returned to Ireland and went to boarding school in the south side in Dublin. She begins writing as a young woman and publishes quite fast, and she's quite precocious as a poet. But gradually she changes, partly because feminism comes on the scene in Dublin, and then Boland herself develops and evolves. She marries and she has children and moves to the suburb in Dublin. These seem like trivial details, but for her they're actually crucial to thinking through her poetic. She builds an anecdote into her essay, and I haven't given you a quotation about this aspect of things, I'll just summarise it. Boland's mother was an artist. She's entirely unknown. Her name is Frances Kelly. And in her essay, The Journey with Two Maps, she recollects an occasion on which she's wandering the streets of Dublin, passes an art gallery, and notices a painting in the window. And it's entirely familiar to her. It is in her mother's style. She recognises the colours, her mother's palette, the kinds of objects her mother primarily did still lifes, the kinds of objects that her mother would paint, everything about the configuration of the painting, identified it as a painting by her mother. And then she was completely shocked to see a man's signature in the corner of the painting. She goes into the gallery, has a discussion with the gallery owner, and he declares that this is correct, that this painting does indeed belong to this male painter. In the essay, Boland neither names the man nor the woman. She talks about her mother as her mother. She doesn't talk about her mother by her given name, and she turns the man into something anonymous. He's just a dash, a blank in the essay. And she recognises that this was her mother's work, but now it has become this man's painting. It was her mother's labour, but she says the price is this man's price, in that as a more important and better known artist, he commands a bigger price. In the essay, she isn't so much angry in a feminist way about the way in which a woman's work of art has been appropriated by the patriarchy, as we would say. She's angry with her mother, and she has seen her mother as a strong individual, and she feels that her mother should never have given her consent. So her anger on this particular occasion seems to be directed against her mother and her mother's handling of her career, and the fact that her mother signs authorship away. And so this becomes a kind of metaphor within the essay for Boland. On the one hand, Boland herself says, as a poet, trying to become a woman poet, she has problems with authorship, but she now also recognises the material and concrete repercussions of particular notions of authorship. Thereafter then, she begins to think about how she started to reformulate herself as a poet. She moves from that generic I, universal I, which is always male, to thinking about herself as a woman poet. And there she had to rethink the pronouns. So this is the quotation from A Journey with Two Maps. I had a new life. The new life she's referring to is marriage and a young daughter. And yet I could see something had survived from the old one. It was that shining eye, that obdurate and central witness of the poet. But there was a problem. If it was changeless, this pronoun in itself, everything it promised, I was not. At times I grew restless with that old glamorous part of speech, that relentless sign of the poet's singular domain. I found that another word, an older one, crept out of the pages of the poems I was reading. Not I any longer, but we. It spoke to me of down-to-earth communities which had once needed a voice, as mine did now. The time would come when this pronoun too seemed open to criticism, when the word it implied seemed another form of constraint. So once again, we can see an argument in motion here, and see a kind of pendulum, an oscillation within the argument of a poet between different modes of identification within the poem. Boland seems to embrace the I then she sets it aside in preference for the we. And the we for her is important, not because of any kind of solidarity that it might give voice to, but because simply it will give voice to things. It will allow her to make things speak, and also give herself a voice. In the poem, or in the essay, she talks about authorship in terms of self-authoring as well. And so her dilemma and predicament are that not alone does she want now to become a poet in a new way, as a woman poet, but she also wants to have a sense that she can author this self. If we move to the next essay in the same collection, we can see how Boland is torn between these dual aspects of things. The lyric I, which now has been redefined as female and as capable of moving between an I and a we. Two words haunted Irish poetry when I was young. Those two pivotal words were I and we. The word which showed most signs of distress was not the I. This was the controversial pronoun, certainly, but there remained something solid about it, not so the we. With time and uncertainty, whole worlds on which they had once depended, from which it spoke in the poem, had vanished. Entire constituencies were gone. Amongst them, Speranza's Ireland. Speranza is the mother of Oscar Wilde, who was a nationalist poet at the end of the 19th century, and Boland seems to particularly have a quarrel with poets like Speranza in her critical meditations. A nation-state rallied by rhetoric, a community bound to it and bandaged by it. I was one of the poets who most benefited in my time from the new and private spaces of the modern Irish lyric. In the disintegration of the Irish public poem, the future of poets like myself was made possible. She's been very declarative and definitive here, but of course there are many question marks about what she says. Boland has written many public poems, in fact, so she flies in the face of the evidence of her own output as a poet. But by and large, she's adamant that the space of the Irish lyric poem is a private space associated with a new type of I, a new sense of authorship. And it's this space that she wants to give voice to in her poetry. I'll move on to two quotations from the two other poets that we'll consider in a moment. Next, Paula Meehan. Meehan is another Dublin poet. She currently has the Ireland Chair of Poetry. She has a very different social background to Anne Boland. She's 10 years younger than Boland, a very brilliant and very distinctive poet. But she comes from working class Dublin. Boland, as you can discern with her father as a diplomat, comes from middle class and fairly wealthy Dublin. Meehan nonetheless attended university in Dublin, went to Trinity College Dublin, and also studied in the States. And she has an entirely different take on the position of the lyric I and the work that the woman poet needs to do. I think all three of these poets would agree that the woman poet serves a kind of ethical function in redefining the lyric I. But for Meehan, this I is public, not private at all. And this is a comment made by Meehan, actually in dialogue with Boland. I have always sensed that poetry is public speech. This is Paula Meehan speaking, a communal art. Even where on the surface it deals with private narratives, or coded secret narratives, or even when the poet pushes language itself to the edge of glossolalia, or as Beckett might put it, to fine aphasia, the poem still desires another human consciousness to resonate with or through. And I think the differences between Meehan's account of poetry and Boland's are apparent here, but it's also clear that these are unfinished issues, and we think them through further in terms of the poems by all of these poets. Finally, I'll touch on Sinead Morrissey and introduce you to her. Sinead Morrissey is from the north of Ireland, which, as you know, is a part of the UK. She was born in Portadown, and she is the youngest of the poets that we'll be looking at. She's only in her 40s. She studied in Dublin, went to Trinity College Dublin, has a different kind of background to the other two poets. Boland abandoned an academic career. Meehan does a BA and an MFA in creative writing. But Sinead Morrissey wrote a PhD in Dublin on the 18th century novel, servants in 18th century novels, as it happens. And her poetry very often plays with intertextuality and intermediality. And she seems to position the lyric I in another kind of domain again. But here again, like with Meehan, we encounter a poet who's wary of what the personal might be. So while Boland seems to regard the personal as the only basis on which she can construct any kind of reliable lyric I, the other two poets have qualms about this space. And I'm quoting Sinead Morrissey. I don't like the straight confessional. You can use your own experiences, but you have to bring more to it than that always. The I is unstable and it transmutes. We move next to the poems themselves, and I'm going to begin with a group of 3 poems from different phases of Evan Boland's career, on which she reflects on a central theme in her poetry, that is the relationship between mother and daughter. I begin with the earliest and shortest of the poems in this light, a very famous one called Nightfield. It was a sensational poem at the time. It was published in a collection published in 1980 because it is very definitely the first poem on this subject in Irish poetry. So Boland on one level is breaking new ground. But what we need to look at in considering the poem is how she's reformulating the space of the poem and where the author is and what the importance of the lyric I might be. Who is speaking from the space of the lyric I, and what is the bond between the mother and daughter here? Nightbeat. This is dawn, believe me, this is your season, little daughter. The moment daisies open, the hour mercurial rainwater makes a mirror for sparrows. It's time we drowned our sorrows. I tiptoe in, I lift you up, wriggling in your rosy, zipped sleeper. Yes, this is the hour for the early bird and me, when finder is keeper. I crook the bottle, how you suckle. This is the best I can be. Housewife to this nursery, where you hold on, dear life. A silt of milk, the last suck, and now your eyes are open, birth-coloured and offended. Earth wakes, you go back to sleep, the feed is ended. Worms turn, stars go in, even the moon is losing face. Poplars stilt for dawn, and we begin the long fall from grace. I took you in. So to consider the relationship between mother and daughter here in the poem, on one level the poem seems idyllic. The poet speaks from the position of the lyric I, a kind of poetic voice speaking. This is your seasoned little daughter. She's speaking from another position as well, the position of mother. So this is a new kind of perspective being introduced into the Irish poem. It's not merely an autobiographical one. It's a perspective that has a symbolic and aesthetic weight for Boland. However, when you begin to analyse the poem more closely, you see that it's not totally idyllic, that there's a kind of pendulum movement within the images. There's a movement between images that suggests security on the one hand. This is your seasoned little daughter. The quietness of the moment, and the fact that this lyric I is not just solitary. She's alone with her daughter, feeding her in the middle of the night. It seems a safe, transpersonal space. Intersubjective one, maybe to a degree. But there's also kind of a suggestion of dangers at the edge of this world. So the mother here is not a lyric I in terms of a lyric I who's all powerful. She can feed her daughter now, but things will change. For instance, the phrase at the beginning of the poem, "It's time we drowned our sorrows," seems odd. You go to the pub to drown your sorrows. At the end of the poem, there's a sense of the world turning and time moving on in a very beautiful, harmonious way. But there's also a sense of things changing and other things emerging, worms turning. When the worm turns, that means maybe someone's going to contradict you or fight back against you. I move next to another mother-daughter poem written by Boland, and this is possibly one of her most famous poems, The Pomegranate. It's the most anthologized of her poems. Here she's speaking to a daughter again. Boland has two daughters. It's really hard to work out which one of the daughters she's talking to in each of the poems. She doesn't name her either, ever. And it indicates to us that this daughter is symbolic. She's not just the real-life daughter that Boland has. And to give you a slight context in advance before I read The Pomegranate, Boland here is playing with the classical legend of Ceres and Proserpine. She names them in the poem. In the classical legend, there are various permutations of it, of Ceres and Proserpine. Proserpine is violently abducted by Hades, hell, and raped by him and taken into the underworld at the connivance of Zeus. Ceres tries to frantically win her daughter back, and she does so through the force of her personality and her anger. She quarrels with Zeus and forces him to reach an agreement with Hades that he will release her daughter. And so it seems like Persephone will come back to the real world from the underworld. But Hades tries to tempt her back again. So the daughter is actually lost in twice over in the legend. Persephone sometimes eats an apple and sometimes a pomegranate, and hence the title of Boland's poem. She bites the pomegranate, and this is an indication that she then has to return to the underworld. But once again, Ceres quarrels with Hades and Zeus, strikes a bargain with them, and they come to a compromise. Persephone stays in the underworld, as many of you will know, for 2 seasons of the year, autumn and winter, and for the other 2 seasons, she returns to her mother, spring and summer. And this Eleusian myth or mystery is about the managing of female power and also fertility. So let's look at Boland and her rewriting of this classical legend, and also her rewriting and expansion of this intersubjective new space of the authorial self, who wields a different kind of lyric I now in the poem. The only legend I have ever loved is the story of a daughter lost in hell and found and rescued there. Love and blackmail are the gist of it, Ceres and Persephone the names. And the best thing about the legend is I can enter it anywhere and have. As a child in exile in a city of fogs and strange consonants, I read it first. And at first I was an exiled child in the crackling dusk of the underworld, the stars blighted. Later I walked out in a summer twilight, searching for my daughter at bedtime. When she came running, I was ready to make any bargain to keep her. I carried her back past white beams and wasps and honey-scented buddleias. But I was Ceres then, and I knew winter was in store for every leaf on every tree on that road, was inescapable for each one we passed, and for me. It is winter and the stars are hidden. I climb the stairs and stand where I can see my child asleep beside her teen magazines, her can of Coke, her plate of uncut fruit, the pomegranate. How did I forget it? She could have come home and been safe and ended the story and all our heartbroken searching, but she reached out a hand and plucked a pomegranate. She put out her hand and pulled down the French sound for apple and the noise of stone and the proof that even in the place of death, at the heart of legend, in the midst of rocks full of unshed tears, ready to be diamonds by the time the story was told, a child can be hungry. I could warn her, there is still a chance. The rain is cold, the road is flint-coloured, the suburb has cars and cable television, the veiled stars are above ground, it is another world. But what else can a mother give her daughter but such beautiful rifts in time? If I defer the grief, I will diminish the gift. This legend will be hers as well as mine. She will enter it as I have. She will wake up. She will hold the papery flush skin in her hand and to her lips. I will say nothing. I'll begin first by quoting a set of comments made by Adrienne Rich in Of Woman Born, thinking about the absence of any prominent myths in Western culture about mothers and daughters. Rich reflects that if you think about the most prominent myths like Oedipus, King Lear or Hamlet, we have myths that think about father and daughters, son and mother, sons and mothers in different ways in Oedipus and Hamlet, but very few myths that reflect on the mother and daughter. But Rich, like a lot of other feminist poets, reckons that this myth of Ceres and Proserpine that has been sidelined could be thought of as the central template or myth for the relationship between mothers and daughters. Rich, in recuperating the myth in her book of Woman Born, sees the myth of Ceres and Proserpine as hinging on the potency of the mother. So she sees this as a myth about the power of a mother that has to be somewhat suppressed, but that still asserts itself. Boland's poem, I think, works differently. And Boland is influenced by Rich. Rich would have been one of the influences on her in her formulation of herself as a woman poet. In that the mother, I think, in the pomegranate, and this is something maybe we can return to in the discussion period, has a certain kind of power. She does have that kind of priestly power, otherworldly power, of the poetic voice himself in a lyric poem. But she's also restricted too. And she doesn't seem to want to exert this power anyway as a kind of omnipotence. She inserts herself into the poem in lots of different ways. She seems to begin as a reader, a kind of observer of the world, the only legend I have ever loved. She's certainly the mother all over again, very distinctively so. And she reflects upon how the myth of Ceres and Proserpine impinged on her own life as a little girl lost in London. And then she turns to the dangers, her anxieties that she has for her own daughter. And once again brings you to this intersubjective space between mother and daughter. It's intersubjective, I think, because it's an affective space of unvoiced emotion, but not because Boland tries to voice things for her daughter. She never puts things in the daughter's voice. She speaks herself in her own voice. And the ending of the poem retains that sense of security that one had in Night Feet, of a world where there is a we, where the lyric I is not just about the solitary self, where it can be interpersonal, where the woman transcends herself to commune with her daughter. But she also pulls back from the we, as she did in her critical essay. She recognises that she can't change the myth. She can't invent a myth that will somehow dictate the future for her daughter. Or indeed, she's also recognising that she can't cancel out death in the way that Ceres seemed to do in the classical legend. Or indeed, maybe violence. Although one could argue that Boland does try to cancel out the violence of the myth, at the very, very least in this poem. It's only there very obliquely. I'll turn finally to a very recent mother-daughter poem written by Boland. She's talking now to an adult daughter. So it's the same daughter that grows with her in these poems and that changes with Boland as Boland herself ages. And this is the poem Talking to My Daughter Late at Night. And this is from Boland's very last collection, which is titled A Woman Without a Country. It came out in 2014, the year that Boland herself turned 70. And symbolically, she wanted the volume out for this birthday. Talking to my daughter late at night. We have a tray, a pot of tea, a scone. This is the hour when one thing pours itself into another. The gable of our house stored in shadow, a spring planet bending ice into an absolute of light. Your childhood ended years ago. There is no path back to it. There's no certainty I can find, the if or maybe, that might remedy an afternoon you walked up the hill after school, in winter, in tears. The fire smoulders down into cinders, lilac shivers in the March dark. If love is a civilization, as I once hoped it was, and you and I are its living citizens, and if our words are less than rules and more than remedies, as we speak, maybe someone escapes from a wounded morning in a small classroom and finds the world is not stern after all. Paper birds are folded and fly off into the playground, and when lessons resume in the afternoon, the essay is easy. It is a day in the life of a penny. Afterwards, at tea time, the sweets have old names: cinder, toffee, bullseye, marry me quick. The children shout out, and I listen to hear your voice with theirs. But no, it's here now, telling me how late the hour is, the birds almost up. And we smile at this as we put the tray away, douse the fire, and wash out the cups. It's a familiar scene. It's clearly a self-reflexive poem, an older poet returning to the ground of her aesthetic, the means by which she altered and changed the space of an Irish lyric poem to include the details of a suburban life, a mother looking after her daughters in the south side of Dublin, but repaints it all over again and changes the potency of this space. Boland, in one of her essays, noted that poetry seemed to have no space for interiors, that you see interiors in novels, but you rarely encounter them in poems. In the lyric poem, you encounter interiority, but not the indoor space of a family home. And it's this indoor space that she consistently describes in these poems. You get a sense of these rooms in this one house. She's always lived in the same house. However, it's a space that connects to other things. In this poem, once again, she's thinking about the bond between mother and daughter and how it can express herself. In some ways, she's possibly mocking herself here, in that her aesthetic is in danger of becoming sentimental. She goes back to that moment in the pomegranate when the daughter is endangered. And it's only a minor danger. It's not a big mythic danger. It's a little girl coming home in tears from school. And this time she does try to rewrite history. And she tries to make it good to her daughter in the past. But the poem immediately moves on from that and recognises that this is a myth. And this is the lyric I trying to change things to be omnipotent. In some ways, the details anyway aren't convincing, and the kind of school day that she seems to be talking about seems further back in time than the childhood of her own daughter. So it seems maybe a little too nostalgic. It's interesting now that the voice of the daughter emerges here at the end of the poem. The I, as mother and poet and mythmaker, is listening out for the voice of her daughter, but she's listening out for children's voices. And instead, she says, that voice is telling me now how late the hour is. So this is her daughter in the present, bringing her back to a kind of reality, but also that mythic space of mother and daughter together that Boland constantly conjures up in her poems. It usually is a nocturnal world rather than an everyday world, and it's usually not a world flooded with sunshine. I move finally to an elegy from an earlier collection that Boland wrote for her mother, an elegy for my mother in which she scarcely appears. And I'm touching on this poem to give you an example of a different kind of occasion in which Boland repaints the categories of the author and the elasticity of the lyric I in the poem. She's shown that the I can be multiple, it can be plural, it can include a you, another voice, a sleeping daughter who has to be attended to but not spoken for. And here her dilemma is to try and think about her mother, and her mother who is dead. And she thinks about her mother through objects in the house, those everyday objects that are left behind in a house when somebody dies. And the clothes horse that she talks about is a stand on which you put your clothes. It's not a horse. And the fire dogs are usually ornaments beside a fire, but they might have a poker or a brush with which you fix the fire or lay the fire. An elegy for my mother in which she scarcely appears. I knew we had to grieve for the animals a long time ago, weep for them, pity them. I knew it was our strange human duty to write their elegies after we arranged their demise. I was young then and able for the paradox. I am older now and ready for the question, what happened to them all? I mean to those old dumb implements which have no eyes to plead with us like theirs, no claims to make on us like theirs. I mean, there was a singing kettle. I want to know why no one tagged its neck or ringed the tin base of its extinct design, or crouched to hear the rising shriek in winter, or wrote it down with the birds in their blue sleeves of air, torn away with the trees that sheltered them. And there were brass fire dogs which lay out all evening on the grate, and in the heat thrown at them by the last of the peat fire, but no one noted down their history, or put them in the old packs under slate blue moonlight. There was a wooden clothes horse, absolutely steady, without sinews, with no mane and no meadows to canter in, carrying, instead of landlords or Irish monks, rinsed tea-cloths, but still I would have thought worth adding to the catalogue of what we need, what we always need. As is my mother on this Dublin evening of fog crystals and frost, as she reaches out to test one corner of a cloth for dryness, as the pre-war Irish twilight closes in and down on the room, and the curtains are drawn, and here am I, not even born, already a conservationist, with nothing to assist me but the last and most fabulous of beasts, language, which knows, as I do, that it's too late to record the loss of these things, but does so anyway, and anxiously, in case it shares their fate. Now, the mother in the poem, as Boland intimates in the title, is a kind of ghost and spectre in the way that the daughter is this lovely ghostly presence in the other poems as well. She's rendered there on the scene, but she doesn't become fully concrete. And in this manner, in this kind of affective space of absence, Boland is expressing her grief. And you'll notice that the poem has proliferation of I statements, and the I is repeated in numerous different ways within the poem. It seems to be both the biographical I, Boland speaking as poet, the poet trying to think about her aesthetic. Can she save these objects by writing about them? Can she commemorate her mother, maybe save her mother by talking about her? But she's also now writing from the position of the daughter too, of course, the daughter who has lost her mother. And she writes too from this other space, the space of language, a space that's beyond pronouns, beyond the I, or the you, or the we, a language that simply struggles to record a female world. I move on next, and much more briefly, to the two other poets, starting with Paula Meehan. And the poem I want to read is the third part of three poems written by Paula Meehan about her family. In the first poem in the Troika, the three poems, she writes about an occasion on which her family are evicted from an apartment, a flat that they were renting in Dublin. They ran out of money, and the landlord got violent. In the second poem in the Troika, she writes about an uncle who is alcoholic and abusive. But in the third poem, which she calls This Is Not a Confessional Poem, she writes about her mother. Meehan usually writes often about family members in her poems, but usually about her grandmothers. And she sees them, her grandmothers, who come from working class Dublin, as the source of her poetry. It's from the grandmother's voices that she gets her poetic self and the lyric I that speaks in her poems. But this is a different kind of poem, a poem about a mother and not about a mother, as you will see. She's writing from Greece. Meehan regularly goes on holidays to the islands in Greece, and many of her poems bring with them the atmosphere of these islands and the classical legends and myths of the ancient Greek world. This is not a confessional poem. I write it in the light of ancient Greece, or in the ancient light of this mountain. I write it in the shadow of the myths, or in the shadow of the people who made them. I do not know that I have the right to say such things. I only know I found her in the cold light of Finglas. Finglas is a suburb of Dublin. My mother, curled to a fetal question in the backyard. The stars were glittering eyes in the night. The glass was rimed with frost and crunched underfoot. I remember thinking how ill-clad she was for the night that was in it. Her brushed nylon pyjamas, her thin, bare feet, ill-shod. Not a sound to be heard in the sleeping estate. Far off a dog, then another. A car starting up, the engine having trouble catching. I had woken from a dream of summer, my first lover, to shouts and doors banging. I had woken to my father calling out my mother's name again and again, and dear sweet Jesus, and oh Christ. The downstairs windows were all open wide. It brought the frosty air inside. You could still smell the gas. I found her with her head in the oven. I dragged her outside. Was all he said then and ever after. As if to allay accusation or set his own story straight, or give the only fact worth recording. He was not a man for elaborations, stoic or cynic. To this day, I'm still in doubt. Laconic, for sure. Though far from ancient Sparta he was reared, he would have fitted in. We thought she was dead. Her feet were like ice in my hands. Were it not for the night that was in it, we might have missed her breath. The thin reed of it rising, her sad tune to the air, proof positive she was still there. We carried her in between us, my father and I, never again that close or complicit, never again the same as we were. The doctor, when she came, was drunk and worse than useless, prescribed more sleepers and downers, pocketed her fee and stumbled towards her car. The sun was coming up, the children were whinging for their breakfast, the older ones were rushing off to school. And that is how I leave them now. I pull the door behind me firmly closed. The past is a lonely country. There are no charts, no maps. All you read is hearsay, as remote as the myths of this Greek island, where one small boat putters out to sea in a blaze of morning sunlight, dragging my attention in its wake. Now, the poem very obviously advertises itself as not a confessional poem, not belonging to that mode of autobiographical poetry that reigned supreme for a while in the 20th century, and still is a category of lyric verse to the present day. Bowen clearly is resurrecting some kind of memory, but it's a memory that she cautiously approaches because we only know it through her. She doesn't suggest that she's an unreliable narrator, but nor does she suggest to us that she's giving us the truth. She seems often to isolate incidental detail and sideline things within the poem. Clearly, it's a poem about her mother, but like with Bowen's poem, the mother is both there and not there. She actually says more about her father than her mother within the poem. And clearly it's a poem about a suicide attempt by her mother that has been repressed in family memory, that Boland now is voicing. I have no idea whether it's truthful or not, so I should add that as a proviso. But I think it is, that it is based on a factual incident. But what's important to Boland is not the authenticity of her voice or her attempt to tell her mother's story. It's very noticeable that the poem is about a play with presence and absence. The poet is there, once again, as a myth maker, an author, a traveller, an observer, as a daughter. And she wakes from a dream of summer and her first lover, so she's presumably a teenager at this point in her life. And the voice that she captures is the voice of her father and her siblings when they're whinging for breakfast at the end. The mother never speaks. However, it's the mother who possibly delivers the greatest poetic moment within the poem, apart from impinging on the affects, the unspoken emotions of the poem. They think the mother is dead, but they see her breath in the cold winter air, and because of that know that she's alive. And the way that Boland describes it is that her mother's breath becomes a type of poetry writing. The thin reed of it rising, her sad tune to the air, proof positive that she was still there. It's almost like the archetypal lyric poem, a type of wordless music or poetry being performed to the lyre. But like Boland, at the end of her poems about her mother and her daughters, Meehan draws back as well. So she doesn't want the omnipotence of the male author. She turns her back on this story about her parents and issues a kind of caution to us as readers as well. Maybe we have been manipulated. Even when someone says this is not a confessional poem, you expect a confessional poem of some kind. So you're drawn into the emotions of the poem. But the poem ends with a kind of wariness and returns you to the poet in the present, who seems not so much detached, but at least somehow remote from this early history of herself. So you don't quite know what the connection between the past and present might be. She suggests, in fact, that there's an absolute cut-off. I'll end finally with the poem Lighthouse by Sinead Morrissey. And this is a poem about a mother and son. Morrissey has two sons. And here she is describing an occasion. Morrissey very rarely writes about family matters. This poem is in a volume called Parallax, and it's a collection that plays with photographic images. Parallax is a technical term in astronomy and in optics, and it talks about the way, or it describes the way in which an object, if viewed from different positions, looks different. And parallax is used in optics, in cameras, to bring together the view from a lens and the view from the rangefinder. It's also used in astronomy to measure distance to planets in our solar system. So it's an image that Morrissey uses within this collection to think about the perspective of the lyric I. And many of her poems are about photographs, old photographs that she looks at. The photographic image on this occasion is a kind of real-life one of her little son in bed, looking at a lighthouse on the Belfast Lough. Morrissey teaches in Queen's University in Belfast, and she lives on the lough where there is a lighthouse. Lighthouse. My son's awake at 10, stretched out along his bunk beneath the ceiling, wired and watchful. The end of August. Already the high-flung daylight sky of our northern solstice dulls earlier and earlier to a clouded bowl. His Star of David lamp and plastic moon have turned the dusk to dark outside his room. Across the loch where ferries venture blithely, and once a cruise ship massive as a palace inched its brilliant decks to open sea, a lighthouse starts its long, night-long address in fractured signalling. It blinks and bats the swing ball of its beam, then stands to catch, then hurls it out again beyond its parallax. He counts each creamy loop inside his head, each well-black interval, and thinks it just for him, this gesture from a world that can't be entered. The two of them, partly curtained, partly seen, upheld in a sort of boy-talk conversation no one else can hear. The private place, it answers, with birds and slatted windows. I've been there. In the poem, existence is described in terms of the unseen and the unheard, and yet things seem to be partly seen and partly heard. The patterns in the poem are the patterns made by the revolving beam of the lighthouse, and also the revolving attention of the little boy and of the mother who's viewing this boy and the lighthouse, and describes the rhythm of seeing and not seeing, going from light to dark. The question is, who is the I at the end of the poem? Is this an I who's similar to the other lyric I's we've encountered in Boland and Morrissey? That private place it answers with birds and slatted windows. I've been there. It could be the mother speaking, but as one reviewer suggested, it's perhaps more likely an object speaking, the lighthouse, speaking to the little boy. And so the mother here, the mother poet, creates another kind of lyric I space for her son this time, not a daughter. And it's a lyric space, once again, that's transsubjective and interpersonal. in which the silent language of this little boy looking at a lighthouse can actually be seen, and in which objects are given a voice. And of course, a poem called A Lighthouse can't but recall Virginia Woolf. In Virginia Woolf, the lighthouse is a kind of destination, a destiny, a deferred end, and also a goal, a desire, female art, and literally the self, the I, the shadow of the I that falls on the page. I'll draw to a close. In What is an Author, Michel Foucault has argued that the function of the author, and I quote, is to characterize the existence, circulation, and operation of certain discourses within a society. Additionally, Foucault claims that what he terms the author function is linked with a plurality of egos. Similar claims, I think, can be made in relation to the lyric I and the modes of subjectivity voiced and configured by the lyric poems written by Roland, Morrissey, and Meehan. As I've shown, the lyric I has always been conceived of in terms of its polarities and contradictions. It is at once a sign of authorial power and eloquence, and also a token of human limitations and fragility. The I marks the presence of the author in the text, but it also marks the vanishing point of this self, the point at which this self perhaps breaks down, or perhaps the point at which this self opens up to other forces, whether they be social, political, or cosmic. The I, as the guarantor of particular kinds of poetic truth and vision, has been particularly problematic for women poets in Ireland, who sought to change the scope and ambit of poetry in the latter half of the 20th century. The work of Boland, Meehan, and Morrissey constantly exposes the limits of the authorial or lyric I and pushes it into dialogue with a you, a we, and a host of other ghostly presences, sons, daughters, clothes horses, lighthouses, and so on. And these other presences undermine the claims of the I to roundedness or inclusiveness. Lost daughters and mothers and irrecoverable moments haunt the works of these poets. Silent, unspoken intuitions and the unspeakable often push against the boundaries of these poems, even when the I seems to be in charge and in control. The solitary self of the traditional lyric I is often replaced by the communal, the transsubjective, and impersonal in these lyrics. The death of the author, however, is not a fait accompli in these poems. Rather, it is something that is constantly staged, rethought, and recast to the multiple dialogues, exchanges, shadowings, and shadings in these poems. And the renewed power and promise of the lyric I is constantly asserted, even as it is also questioned and undermined. And the author may be dead, but she has created distinctive alternative voices and metaphorical frames and spaces through which difference can be viewed, and the ethical claims of silenced objects and subjects and lost selves and counter selves may be articulated. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, for this spectacular presentation, which of course I will not attempt at summarizing. What I want to do is to make an emphasis on the three names that were mentioned as examples, the three poets that Anne was dealing with, and just open the possibility for people to make comments or ask questions or establish a dialogue with the material.
Well, I'd like to thank you for this wonderful presentation and for introducing us to these three poets. And also what I was able to appreciate is the difficulty of the task. and I congratulate you for it, because in poetry of this kind, which is fragmented by nature and just the superposition of images, tracing the eye, it can be either too easy or too difficult. So choosing to deal with that problem anyway is a very brave decision. And modernistic poetry always has this maybe slightly irresponsible strain that says, well, if you want to see the eye, well, the lyric I here, it's your problem. I did not intend that. Or contrary-wise, whatever is convenient. So I was wondering how do you think writers, especially women poets, deal with this in view of tradition, of an established tradition of male poets who have created these very strong eyes. I think you mentioned it a little bit at the beginning, distinguishing the he and the she.
Yeah. Yeah. That certainly was part of the struggle that Roland had. She found herself having to fight on many different fronts in that she wanted to get her everyday life into poems. Then, like all people who became feminist in that era, suddenly they realised the degree to which literature had been male-dominated. I did a degree in English literature in the 1970s in a Southern Irish university, and I think the only woman author we studied was Jane Austen. There were no other women writers on the course at all. So Bullen's quarrel is certainly with the tradition. Actually, often not with the male poets themselves. Those she interacts with. She's very influenced by Yeats and constantly invokes him as a literary influence, actually consistently throughout her career, which seems surprising because the Irish male poets felt they had to reject Yeats. Yeats is the big Irish modernist poet, and she's important not just because of the modernism of his later poetry, but because he's also linked with the birth of modern Ireland and the Irish literary revival, and so he hugely dominates the scene. What Bullen really, and again this is the feminist struggle, was struggling against was the institutions of literature and the way that authority is assigned, what poets are published, who ends up in an anthology, who controls the voices. In some ways, her account of her struggle as a young poet is inaccurate, or at least she's blanking out some aspects of her own existence. She's been attacked by feminist critics for not acknowledging the existence of other women poets enough, even in the 60s, even if they weren't given a kind of weight and authority in Ireland at that time. They certainly did exist. And it's probably true they probably weren't there in the English language all that much. And she had to look, as a young woman, she felt she had to look for foremothers to British poetry or American poetry, not to Ireland, to Emily Dickinson, Adrian Rich, and many others. And it's only later that she discovers the women poets in the Irish literary tradition. And that's simply because, in some ways, we didn't know about them. Feminism hadn't happened yet. Feminist presses hadn't been set up. Irish feminism was a little bit belated, I think, anyway, compared to feminism in UK and elsewhere. So it's in the 70s and 80s that a very activist women's movement gets going, sets up presses, begins to publish women's writing, and puts them out there. And suddenly it became apparent that, of course, women were writing. Then in the later period again, the feminist histories are written. And of course now, the kinds of statement that Boland made that there were no other female mentors or role models for her there when she was a 20-year-old really disproved themselves. But that is the effect of ideology. It blanks things out in the world. So I think her quarrel is not so much with the male poets themselves and the value of their work. It's not a kind of knee-jerk reaction. She certainly reads their poetry and they read hers. And she's part of she's the Seamus Heaney generation of poetry, so she knows a lot of, is friends with a lot of the very influential male poets. They, on the other hand, are very wary of her because she got branded as this very outspoken feminist poet in that she really had to fight her corner to begin with. Not so much in the poems themselves, but in the statements that she made about poetry. So she had to fight that male tradition and find those other voices. In her poems, she's doing it in a different way. I showed you her personal and her poems about her house and her family, and that very ordinary suburban home which most people in Dublin live in if they're lucky. But she's many other poems that go back to moments in Irish history and try to look at, again, not the remarkable figures in the past, but those voices that have been silenced. She's a very beautiful poem about people dying in the famine in Ireland. She's written some other very iconic poems about emigrants, but largely she talks about the female emigrant on the boat to the United States rather than the male emigrant. She's conscious, however, that this could be a false move, and this is something she's aware of in her poems as well, that if you are given some kind of authority as a poet, because we expect lyric poets to express things for us and to speak some kind of truth, even if it's a truth they're sceptical about, that you could end up speaking for other people. So she's aware of the fact, always in her poems, that go back to the past, that you can't ever really get there, that what the poem gives you is a figment. So it's a bit like Paul and Meehan trying to think about what's a repressed memory anyway. She knows that in a way her poem can't do that. So Boland knows that too. There definitely would be a danger of a white middle class woman who now, Boland now is a professor of creative writing in Stanford, trying to speak for other people and to give them voices. So what she tries always to do is to give a kind of silenced voice, an oblique voice, a voice that you kind of see, or a presence, you know, like the daughter sleeping, you kind of person there and not there. But she doesn't want to become authoritarian about it, to go back to that aspect of authorship.
This perhaps is a difficult question, but you just spoke about the Irish tradition.
Yes.
And we were talking about it earlier, and I wonder if this dialogue is going on between the writers who write in English and those who write in Irish.
Yes. Yeah. As some of you may know, we have two languages in Ireland. In fact, the first national language is a language the Irish people called Irish. In the US, it's referred to as Gaelic, and the Irish word is Gaeilge. Our educational system is bilingual. Everybody learns Irish in school, but it's a very failed enterprise because the Irish somehow turned their back on the Irish language. Actually, after the famine, there was a major famine in Ireland in the middle of the 19th century. And after that point, many of the Irish speakers died or emigrated. And people who wanted to survive identified with the colonists, with the English in Ireland. The school system anyway forbade the use of Irish. So the language died out a good deal. It's still alive in parts of Ireland, but I think there's little hope it'll really come back. There's certainly poets who write in Irish and in English. It's a conflict line, I think, to a degree. Some of the poets who write in Irish are adamant that their poetry should not be translated because they want to preserve the integrity of the language and not to cave in to the colonised English that we perforce speak in Ireland. But there are many other poets who are translated. And there's a very crucial woman poet, Nuala Gono, who writes very beautiful poetry using Irish folklore, for instance, and she has been very influential. Her poetry has been translated. Sometimes these are parallel worlds. Ireland is not a divided society anymore in the way that it once was, but languages certainly can divide people. Most of the English speakers in Ireland, even if university trained, won't have fluent Irish. So even if they want to appreciate the poetry of their fellow country people written in Irish, they simply wouldn't understand it. So Irish is written for a small niche market in Ireland. It's subsidised by the government. There's a government policy to promote writings in Irish. You could say that translation then would be the tool, and it certainly helps. I grew up as an Irish speaker because I have a mother who came from the west of Ireland, but that's a privilege a lot of people don't have. And because it's an enforced language policy, people view Irish quite negatively, and it's still somehow seen, I think, by some Irish people as a peasant language, a downtrodden language. And there's a good deal of work being done currently to work out why the Irish so quickly abandoned their own language in the 19th century. It's almost inexplicable that it could have happened so quickly to a people who hung on to very many other aspects of their culture very strongly, as Yeats and other writers show, like storytelling and folklore, music, and revived other ones like the games and so on, Gaelic games, during the Irish revival. The two languages coexist, of course. An Irish speaker is always going to be bilingual. It's going to speak English and Irish. So it's a kind of other area of silence and tension. I think English speakers in Ireland also feel guilty for their own neglect of an aspect of their heritage, which one half of their brain tells them they should know about and should appreciate, and another half of the brain really has rejected because we turn to Britain and the US. Our culture is very much Anglophone.
I want to say thank you for the beautiful poetry you read. We seldom read female authors, and sometimes when we read them, even the teachers, I remember once we were reading Robert Lowell and Sylvia Plath in the same day. Yeah. And we read Skunk Hour, which is amazing and I love, and we talked about how Robert Lowell is bipolar and he was having an episode and how it was very difficult to analyze. Skunk Hour. Yet everybody was very enthralled with it. And then we read Lady Lazarus by Sylvia Plath. And the teacher and many students said that it was theatrical and dramatic and too much. So reading poetry about women, mothers who talk to their daughters and who have tea kettles and those horses is inclusive and it's valid. It's a way of saying that it is also valid to talk about your daughter and your kettle. And I thank you for that.
Those are good points. I mean, there are lots of people who kind of groan when they come across yet another Irish poem about family life or something like that. So it does show you that the early poets maybe have an advantage, like Boland, in that she is the first to address these topics in terms of, an Irish mother poeticizing her life and finding a symbolic language for it. But I think confessional poetry, or any poetry that has an autobiographical roots, and maybe a lot of poetry has, but that is something we have to be wary of, is always going to be an inventive language, a symbolic language. Poets may feed up their life in some ways. Some poets are more parasitic of their family experiences, the experiences of people around them than others. But it's the experience, I think, is changed in the poem. It has to be transmuted in some fashion. So it's not just kind of poetry as therapy, voicing something to get it out there. I think that wouldn't be sufficient. Sometimes it may be, it could be in performance art. Rap poetry tends, for instance, to be very immediate and to the moment, just to talk about current emotions and things that are going on. So maybe I'm being too precious about what a lyric poem should or should not do. But yeah, I agree with you that that's something that certainly happened, but it happened with the modernist poets as well. Those boundaries between the poetic and the non-poetic broke down. And poets are still doing that now. They're still trying to show that poetry can include everything. Because I think possibly in every tradition there's still a sense that poetry is always sacred and religious, that it's the most high-minded of the literary forms and not as accessible, possibly as you're saying, because poems are more difficult to decipher. You can't just change them, translate them over into prose and then think you understand them. You have to work with them. They're like linguistic puzzles, games that the poets play with us. But I think it is important that poetry widen itself and include things. But just including may not be enough.
Well, I was thinking about this Niehan's "This is not a confessional poem."
Yeah.
About the relationship between poetry and narrative, because we make many assumptions about poetry in contrast to narrative, and you already talked a little bit about this, but if you want to comment further on this, thank you.
It's a good point, and one I should have made. The poem is unusual where Meehan is concerned. Meehan writes very beautiful, expressive poetry, but it's usually imagistic and not at all narratively driven. So there's something unusual about the kind of compulsive onward motion of this particular poem. And it's driven by the eye constantly discovering things, and that adds to I suppose your curiosity as a reader and the sense of search within the poem. By and large, lyric poetry is not narrative. Ballads would be narrative. Epic poems can include narrative. So I think maybe she's playing with the sense the way in which narrative might satisfy us as readers, because she's already given us this little clue of this is not a confessional poem, which sets off the trigger immediately for the reader. So you're on a quest too. You want to find out what she has to tell you, and it is horrific. It is a terrible truth, and you could recoil, because I don't know what her family thinks about this particular poem. Her parents now are dead. So possibly she's only free to write this kind of poetry late in life. She turned 60 last year. So maybe now she can only tell this narrative. But there's a sense in which too she has to bring the narrative to a halt. She stops it. And you end up in a very different kind of space. So it's a broken narrative. And maybe one that we're guilty of. We're complicit as readers in creating the narrative with her, because you do want to find out. And the language is very declarative. It gives you, it's like an inventory of the details. What she sees, what she hears, what happens.
Especially because it's a poem and not a tale. I mean, if it was a novel or a narrative, titled "This is not a confessional narrative," we would perhaps.
That's a nice point, and one thing I hadn't reflected on is that as you read it, if one reads it as a narrative, that actually disturbs one kind of function, one author function of the lyric I, that it can't be expressive in the same way, because it seems to be storytelling here. Even though she's told you that she's not going to use myths, she doesn't want to find some convenient classical legend that will somehow allow her to tell this terrible story about her family. And it's also, of course, the kind of story that you're ashamed of. Families don't talk about because it's seen as a failure. And also, of course, they were protecting the mother. she intimates in the earlier points that it's because of poverty, because the family's out of money, and on hard times that the mother is driven to commit suicide. So she needs to be tactful and cover it all up, but she's also telling you about it. I think also partly she wants to tell the story because she links her discovery of poetry with her working class Dublin grandmothers who teach her how to speak. Leland, if you check online, you'll find her reading on YouTube, and she speaks in a working class Dublin accent, very distinctive one, very rhythmically. Sometimes she is like Irish musicians or singers hold her ear like this, like hearing the rhythm of her own poems as she's performing them. And she's linked her poetry with her grandmothers, and many of her poems tell you about these grandmothers. Again, it's quite confusing. It's not done in an autobiographical way. They're symbolically there as mentors who help her live her life. Her parents go to England to find work, so she's brought up by her grandparents in Dublin. And one great grandmother even ran a brothel in the Red Class district in Dublin that Joyce writes about in the Circe episode of Ulysses. So perhaps here I think maybe she's trying to link that voice to the mother at last, but it's not a voice that can be expressed in a lyric way. And the mother, of course, never speaks. The only voicing that the mother does is when she seems to come back from death, and her breath can be seen. But it's a breath that seems almost to sing in some way. So I think she does try to capture another kind of beginning of a lyric voice here. And this is akin to some of the ideas that were spoken about this morning of the textual body. I think all of these poets are in unison in trying to find their voices. They're all very intellectual poets, they are very literary, but they find their voices in people and families, people who have mentored them. That's where their poetic voice seems to spring from. So yeah, that was a good point.
I think someone was going to ask over there. I saw a hand going. Maybe he or she regretted it. Anyone else? Maybe I would like to ask a question. And it's just that it calls my attention that despite the fact that
you mentioned in pomegranate that there was a symbolic drama. I was wondering if maybe this use of the symbol had what its relationship with the symbolic that she earlier wrote about. And I was wondering if the myth had any relationship to the use of the myth that Jace did. Yeah, maybe you said this earlier, but I was wondering if you could please talk to us about the use of the myth and if it related to the use of the myth that Jace used.
That's a big question. Yeah. I think all Irish poets can but be influenced by Yeats, but like all literary giants in a particular tradition, people tend to have to move away from a very influential literary predecessor like Yeats. So possibly myth is used in a different way, certainly by the women poets. If you've read Yeats, you may know that of the many strands of mythography within Yeats's poetry is the love poetry that he writes about Maud Gonne and some other women, but primarily Maud Gonne, who becomes for him a kind of epitome, a national ideal. Maud Gonne was an Irish nationalist, a feminist, suffragette. She wrote journalism, was a friend of Yeats, but also his lover. And he mythologizes her in his poetry. You know, Sucking Troy turns her into Helen of Troy. For Yeats, I think maybe the reaching for myths is perhaps more automatic, and Yeats invents his own visionary method. In a vision, he allocates roles, mythic roles, visionary roles to everybody and phases of existence, to all the different phases in history as well. So I think the poets who come later are more questioning of the use of myth, because of the way in which Yeats used it. But nonetheless, they are following in his footsteps. Yeats goes out of his way not just to use classical myth, but to bring Irish mythology into poetry and to give it a new kind of importance. And certainly, poets are still doing that, but not. They want to avoid the trap of being seen as this grandiloquent old man in the way that Yeats was by the end of his career, and certainly afterwards. So I think they adopt aspects of Yeats, but they're wary of them, and they're certainly not shy of criticising Yeats as well. So, thank you.
I think that we will have to stop here because we need like 5 minutes just to get some fresh air and then come back for the following panel. So thank you very much, and thank you.